way, if we end up having a conversation that it's not appropriate to share, this might end up on the recording now if we decide to put it up, but at the end of the day, I'm always going to give priority to the students who are here. And sometimes the conversations go off in a different direction. If I can edit those bits out, I do. But if it just turns out there's no recording, that's usually why. Sometimes it's because no one shows up.
Oh.
What can you do? Well, I didn't show up last week, so thank you for your patience with me. There are only 3 people who responded, and even though actually I could have found a time that suited all 3, I think 2 of those were face-to-face students who don't actually come anyway. So I thought it was quite unlikely that it was actually going to work out. So instead, I went to see Katy Perry and had a lovely time, and I'm full of energy now for wherever you're up to. So where are we up to? How are we feeling about the assignment?
Getting my head around it.
I think a picture sometimes tells 1,000 words. I went, yeah, don't worry. This is easy compared to the next one.
Oh, awesome. Yeah.
You'll be fine. You'll be fine. You're all in the same boat. And hopefully you have a bit of fun with it as well. It's really hard in some ways to do an assignment so early, but we kind of have to. You probably work that out by how many assignments you have due before week 6, that the rules are that the first assignment always has to be in that first 6 weeks, ideally with feedback to you even quicker. And I got the shortish straw, and I think contract is one of the first ones. And so it's hard from both sides. I mean, I'm not really expecting you to feel sorry for me, but it's hard for you, the first one, particularly those who, and I know Sue, David, this isn't your first semester either, is it?
No, it is.
It is?
Yes.
So you're in your usual suspect. What about you, Bryony? Is this your first semester?
It's my, I had to think there for a second. It's my 3rd, actually.
Oh, well, so you're an old hand, and I know Sue started last. Yeah, we don't have to worry about you at all. But so for David, this is likely to be your first assignment to submit other than what you've done in intro, right? Which was...
That was the group assignment. So this is with the first proper real assignment after 20 plus years of, being at uni. So
I know. I did an MBA, which I did it over 2011 and 2012. And the first panic attack I think I've had in my entire life, first and only, was basically doing my first exam. And like in that, and I've never had a problem with exams as an undergraduate student. I wasn't worried about it beforehand. That was probably my downfall. It's a big thing. I don't think we should underestimate what a big thing it is to take on study after a long time. Having said that, and it sounds like a really negative thing to say, it's also, what I'm really trying to point out is it's a really common experience to be quite thrown by it early on. And because there is no anchoring, I'm hoping there's a little bit of anchoring if you've done the discussion board tasks, because you've got some sense of what, something much smaller looks like, and you've got a little bit of feedback and all the rest of it. Those of you who've done a couple of assignments before, you've got a sort of sense of that and a sense of the writing. But also you're 5 and a bit weeks in. Well, 4 and a bit weeks in, because you finished week 4 and are starting week 5 tomorrow. With the greatest respect to my awesome teacher, you really haven't learnt very much yet. Particularly at the point where you started the assignment. So it's also tricky to mould a question. And in fact, I think it's impossible to mould a question that only deals with what we've spoken about in class. But at the same time, there are somewhere between 70 and 90 of you that will do that assignment all up. And my experience is that, yeah, a couple of people will fail it, and a couple of people will get HDs, and most people will do somewhere in between. So the curve is very much like that. One of the, in my view, and this is very much my personal view, one of the problems with the marking structures is you really have to totally distinguish yourself from everybody else in order to get 80 or higher. And I'm probably, if you've done a discussion board task now, you'll see I'm a pretty mathematical marker. There should be no surprises. You have a rubric that shows you what I'm looking for. I will tell you whether I found it or what I found in the feedback that I give back to you. And I have my calculator next to me all the time. And I pretty much can tell if this is a fail or pass credit distinction or high distinction. And I will pretty much do the maths that's sitting at the low, top end or middle end of that for whatever the criteria is, and it'll add up. And sometimes I miss stuff that actually happens. I think we all do. That's usually a consequence of the way something's structured or the way that you present. So those of you who write well, it makes it easier for us to find the things that we're looking for. And that's why my advice keeps coming back to be as strategic as you can with the assessment tasks. Make sure that you have understood as much as you can what it is that we're looking for. Make sure you answer the question. Make sure you've had a really good look at the rubric so you've got a sense of what I'm looking for in each of the categories. And then have a go. And the reality is there will be some people who fail this first assignment. Pretty rare, I got to say, to fail this subject overall. Happens, always happens. But, at the end of the day, I work pretty hard to make sure that that doesn't happen too often. Having also been the parent of kids at primary schools where there are always seems to be three groups of students: the students who are doing okay, the students who suck, and the students who really suck. And all of the resources seem to go into the really suck and the suck end of the primary school class. Again, my own view, but you may not share it. And I've often wondered, well, what happens to the bright kids at the other end and the kids who work really hard? And so that's what I spend probably way more of my time than I should be doing, is making sure that the people who are working really hard, who are showing up, who are asking questions, and who are doing the reading, that I'm supporting them as much as I am the ones at the other end. And my version of really suck here in this context is the people who aren't doing the work. So if you're not doing the work, that's your choice and there's not much I can do about it. But the reality is, if you've got into the program, you can pass this subject. And if you get into the program and you work hard, then I'll work with you to make sure you do better than pass it. So that felt a bit sermon-y. I've just been watching The Americans and Pastor Tim. Maybe I'm just getting all sermon-y, but anyway, they're into the sermon. So given that you guys clearly don't suck based on my definition, how can I help you work it? Or do we not want to talk about the assignment at all? We can talk about consideration or offer an acceptance or anything you like, really.
I came to this meeting with an open mind, so I'm just here to learn, really. Whatever.
So this is the first one you've been to, so isn't it?
Yeah.
So sometimes I can't see people until I remember your face. I won't necessarily remember your name. So what I do, I've always got last week's slide pack, right? So worst comes to worst, I can always pull that up and we can talk about anything in particular. But usually what I do is just frame it around the questions that people ask and we just have a conversation. And I really do see it as a drop-in shoot. And it's clearly my face-to-face students are as welcome in this group as my OUA students are welcome in the classroom, the way I see it. But this does have, I really want to do this for OUA. It's like it's the equivalent of my office door being open. And so that, and you're an OUA student, aren't you?
I am, yes.
I can't, sorry, it's terrible. I don't really distinguish except for in that sense. So if there's too many questions, then I always give the OUAs priority. That's pretty much my rule. And if there's not enough, we finish early.
Okay.
Can I raise the question about how you want to format the memo of advice? Because I don't find
Yeah, I'd love to go through that too.
So basically there's no magic to formatting. It should look like a memo. So some people will just launch in, it always happens, but you know, it should look like a memo. And in this slide pack, I had an example of that. It needs to, or just like a memo header. I think my advice in the slide pack was get Bill Gates to format it for you. Like just go into Word or your word processor of choice, look for a memo template and use one that suits. Some people like to do what I call procrastinating designing, which is lovely. So, you know, when you want to feel busy, but you're really procrastinating. And so they'll design a Dennis Denudo firm letterhead, and, you know, a logo and stuff like that, which never fails to amuse me, right? And that's not a bad thing because, you know, if I'm reading a paper with a smile on my face, that's good, right? But it's not going to get you extra marks or anything like that. What I want to see is that you're communicating with your boss in the kind of way that a junior lawyer should communicate with their boss. So the tone of the language needs to be, it doesn't need to be overly formal, but it should be formal and respectful. You know, it should start with Dear Dennis. The memo header should say who it's to and who it's from, and it should have a line in what we usually call the re. So, you know, re short for regarding, which means that if Dennis is shuffling through papers on his desk, he can look at it and see in that one sentence what this memo is about. It should be structured in a way to be helpful. So one of the things we spoke about in class, you would have heard on the recording, was thinking about, well, what's Dennis going to do next when he gets this memo? So what's he using it for? Now, don't get me wrong. The legal profession attracts psychopaths in no short order. There will be people that work in law firms who just want to test you from time to time. But Dennis is not like that. Dennis actually is just a busy suburban practitioner. He wants to go fishing with his mate, and when he comes back, he wants to basically have enough information so he can decide what to do next. So he's asked a very specific question that you should answer. And if I were you, I'd make it really easy for him to see the answer up front. Some people might do that by putting an executive summary in. Some might just be the way that they word it, you know, Dear Dennis, on blah, 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 you ask me about blah, 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 and the short answer is blah. So the reasons are set out below, blah, 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 and your next step should be blah, blah, blah. Maybe fill it out a bit more than blah, blah, blah. But, you know, if you've actually got a case citation that tells you that blah, blah, blah is the correct answer, you know, I'll go with that. So, so things like font, think about that. You don't have to, don't waste too much time on it, but like clearly Wingdings would be ridiculous. I can't read it. Comic Sans might be a little bit silly. You want something that is easy to read and straightforward. Think about the spacing. Think about using headings. One of the things I see way too often is people put something in a heading and then the bit that sits underneath it is not actually, doesn't relate to the heading. Make sure you've got a conclusion. You might actually put the conclusion right up front, but make sure it doesn't just trail off. You know, sometimes memos just end. And all that, I mean, I know that's not format of the memo, it's probably more structure of the memo, and so I'm possibly putting words into your questions, Sue, that weren't there. But think about the whole package. And also, one of the things I love about working with JD students, you're grown-ups too. Think about it, if you were Dennis, put yourself into his shoes. What would you want? What would you need? Now, some people go too far with that, and they tell me later on, well, Dennis would have understood what I meant. So remember that there's a little fantasy here, and I need to understand what you mean too. And so little things like when you reach a conclusion, your arguments, or arguments might even be the wrong word, the analysis that you've done beforehand should all lead to that conclusion. It should be a logical flow. If you're introducing a new idea or a new case in your conclusion, then your analysis, there's something missing from your analysis, or perhaps there was something that you didn't think was important that you've cut out, but your conclusion doesn't work without it. So think about those kinds of things. I don't know, just be awesome.
Right.
I've only had a small glass of wine, but
So put it this way, you want more than just the vibe.
more than just the vibe. And this is why I choose Dennis, actually. And Dennis reminds me of my very first boss, who was a lovely man, but he was a bit doddery in his own way, and he had a bit of an ego. So he didn't like to be like, well, he certainly didn't like to be told he was wrong, but more it was he wasn't very good at admitting that he didn't understand something or that he didn't know the answer. So part of managing up for me as a junior lawyer is the way I imagine you need to manage up if you were working for Dennis. Like, if we've seen The Castle, we know that he's not the world's greatest lawyer, but he doesn't need to be told he's not the world's greatest lawyer. He will benefit from being reminded what the cases are and how the whole thing fits together. But he doesn't need to be spoken to like a 5-year-old. He can read proper legal language. You can use the technical terms appropriately. You can give him a list of references so that he can check what you've looked at. Does that all make sense? It's sort of why I choose him, because I think it's easier for you to get your heads in that space and to write the way that you need to write. Another piece of advice I find myself giving people a lot in a first assignment is try and keep your paragraphs to one idea for each paragraph. Like, lots of short paragraphs often beats one or two very long ones. Give your reader a break. Give me a break. I don't know why it's exhausting to read a page full of dense text, but it is. And it's easier as you're going through to identify the separate ideas if they flow in a logical way. And have a go at using signposting, if you, particularly as there are two issues. So if, and they overlap, they're likely to overlap to a certain extent. Both of them are about whether a contract exists or not, and whether there's an offer or acceptance. Is, you know, Dennis has asked you about the offer and acceptance piece. So my guess is that you might find that there are cases or legal principles that are relevant to both issues. So as you're thinking about how to structure it, think about how you might do that, and then be able to use signposting to point back. So, you know, now having said that, another piece of advice I find I give people often is, as you read a paragraph or some text and you ask yourself, is this just a generic piece of writing about contract law generally, or is it specific to solving this problem? If it's the former, make a copy of it and put it in your notes so that you've got it for your open book exam at the end of the semester. If it's not specific to this problem, really think about whether it's useful or not. I think my dog just saw your cat. Oh no, he's looking off in the other. Oh no, that's what it was. He's now protecting the door to make sure your cat can't get out.
I'm sorry. She just wants my attention.
No, that's what they do. That's what they do. A friend of mine says, if you want your children to read more, you should get a cat, because the cat, every time they try to read, the cat will sit on the book or try and stop them, and it'll make reading seem more attractive to them. They'll want to do more. So, but yeah, not a cat person, and my dog is that bad. Dog is absolutely not a cat person. Oh, he's on guard now. He's so funny. Anyway. Although, as you can see, do you like my cat mask up there?
I love it. Funnily enough, I'm both a cat and a dog person.
Oh no, you have to make a call. That's the other thing, actually. It reminds me, writing legal memos, you have to make a call too. You can't sit on the fence and say it might be this, it might be that, it might be this, it might be that. You do need to explore both sides of the argument. And you might say at the end of the day, there's not a lot in it. Probably use less casual language than that. But on the balance of probabilities, a court is more likely to find this, or it's more likely that that will happen. You really need to really come down one side or the other at some point. So hence, no just cat or dog. No cat and dog. It's one or the other.
All right.
I know I went to a kids' a primary school trivia night last night, and that was part of my costume. I went as Puss in Boots. I was very pleased because I had not paid any attention to that until yesterday morning, and it's amazing what a $7 at Kmart will do for you. And so it's good. Is that at all helpful? I feel like I'm rambling.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Oh, helps a lot, yeah.
Good. So the other question that's come up this week, which I missed on the discussion boards, I did throw it up today, though, was somebody had asked when to use pinpoint referencing and when it doesn't matter. And I answered the question, and then I thought afterwards, I wonder if it's clear what pinpoint referencing is. So pinpointing is when you don't only have the case or the article or, the journal piece, but you have the citation to the source, but you also then pinpoint the page of the judgment or the paragraph or the chapter or whatever. And AGLC has a list of abbreviations that are to be used. In what I think is a flaw of AGLC 3, it asks you to refer to the page of the judgment, not to the paragraph number. But I'll always accept a paragraph number, because particularly for online students, because I know you're not dealing with, well, I really hope you're not printing out the pages of the judgments to read them, and you're getting them from your textbook quite often. So and that will indicate the paragraph numbers, sometimes the pages, depending on how old they are. But basically, and I've been putting this for a few people, and again, I think you guys know that my approach to this will be, you can do something brilliant that is 5 times better than I could ever do myself, and I will still try and find something to help you notch it up or at level. And you can do something that's really, really very ordinary and doesn't pass, and I will still find something to praise in it. It's kind of my own little battle. But I know there's been a few people who've done some really good work recently, and I've said next stage for them is pinpointing. And really pinpointing is just, what it's doing is saying, being able to show me or show whoever's reading, because this is good, I think good advice across all of your subjects. Not only do you know what the best case is to support your analysis or your argument, depending on what you're doing, but you can actually point me to the relevant part of that case.
Yeah. So
it's just, you know, there's not a lot in it, but it's the sort of thing that moves somebody from 79 to 82. Because it's that at this stage above and beyond a little.
Okay.
What about consideration? Should we talk about consideration for a few minutes?
Yep.
I would love to talk about consideration.
So we only really got an intro. Have you had a chance to listen to the recordings for last week?
Not yet, no.
So really, with last week, we still really finished off with acceptance. So it took quite a long time to get through all of those materials, partly because we spent quite a long time on writing a memo in an earlier week before. They all merge into one with me now. And so I really only gave a pretty high level kind of overview of what consideration was and what we'd be looking for and how it fits with offer and acceptance. Again, I'm pretty much guessing that most people's heads are in the offer and acceptance space at the moment because they've got this assignment to do, and that's kind of consideration is not interesting to you just yet. But consideration should be interesting to you because I think once you understand this idea of consideration, the idea of agreement makes more sense. Because even though we separate out the elements of a contract into agreement, comprising offer and acceptance mostly, but if we can't find that, we look for a meeting of the minds. And so that's the Brambles decision. Then we've got consideration, which up until now I've just been loosely calling price. But what I want you to start to do is think about consideration in more sophisticated ways. So I'll come back to that. But then we need attention and we need certainty. Now, consideration is linked to this idea of intention as well. So basically, the jurisprudence behind it appears to be that in order to distinguish a contract, so an agreement that the parties intend to be legally binding on both of them, we need each of the parties to be gaining some benefit and to be suffering some detriment. And that benefit detriment needs to relate to the bargain or the agreement that they've made. So can you see, just even having that conversation, we're kind of smushing that together. And it's even relevant to certainty because certainty is how we identify what the promises are. So if we go and really unpick way back to topic 1, which we've not talked about that much, I keep coming back to it because that's how we do our critical analysis. But in topic 1, we started talking about this idea of a contract as being setting up a kind of private law between individuals, as opposed to a public law, which is something that a government decrees that the law is, or court-made laws that apply to everyone regardless of their situation. So torts are public laws. You have, everybody has duties of care in relation to the kinds of torts that, or the kinds of events that have been classified as torts. But only the parties to a contract have obligations under a contract. So they're private laws. And so in order for a private law to be enforceable, we need to be able to see that the parties intended to be bound by it and to have some certainty as to what it is they're going to be bound by. And consideration goes to that. So we end up with this ridiculous language that just, I get tongue-tied saying it myself, where consideration is the price of the promise. And consideration itself in a bilateral contract is usually another promise. So the example that we were using in class is, if I go to buy a cup of coffee, effectively when the contract is made, I'm promising to pay for the coffee. So I'm promising to suffer a detriment at some future time, probably only 2 minutes from now, maybe immediately. And somebody else is promising to give me a cup of coffee of the type that I've ordered. So the offer, usually, not always, but it's likely in a cafe, what we've got is an invitation to treat. So it's clear to me when I walk into the cafe what on what basis they will accept my offer to buy a coffee. They might even advertise different prices. Say I sit down, somebody comes over to me, I look at the menu, the invitation to treat, and then I order a coffee. That's my offer. It's accepted. Sometimes it's not. The waiter might say, we don't have that anymore. In fact, they might go away and then come back and say that. Technically, maybe the contract's made, maybe it's not. Doesn't sort of really matter mostly, but we'll see how we go. I've made an offer for the coffee. They make the coffee. I get the coffee. It comes to the table. I drink it, and then I pay for it. But at the time the contract's made, the time my offer is accepted, essentially I've promised to pay. They've promised to make me a cup of coffee. So there's an exchange of promises. So when we work through consideration, we'll be looking for that exchange. We'll be looking for the promise to be made or the bargain to be made in consideration of the promise. And then all the rules start to make sense. And there are a lot of rules around consideration. So, for example, past consideration is not good consideration. So we'll talk about this quite a bit next week. And by the way, this set, you don't have to wait for consideration lectures because they're all done as desk lectures. So they're much punchier than listening to the class ones. And you can work through them that way, and there'll be a bit more activity in class, which will mean many of you OUA students won't want to listen to the class recordings at all because they might be just too interactive. But they, I try and take out where people are just talking amongst themselves and stuff, but we'll see how we go. But you shouldn't need to with the way that they work. You've got separate lectures for you to have a look at. Sorry, Susan, you're muted.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
I have seen there are like 5 or 6 lectures. When do you expect us to do them? Like this coming week, or are they spread over a few weeks?
They're quite short compared to, so when I give you a class recording, I usually do it in 2 or 3 recordings, and they'll add up to about 2.5 hours. Those shorter lectures will add up to probably about 1.5 hours because you don't get all of the messing around in between and all the rest of it. So you just get me talking to the slides and focusing it. So basically, I think if you can try and keep with the weeks, so consideration is over 2 weeks. So, if you can have those finished by the end of next week, you'll be in a good place.
Okay.
So, end of this week, isn't it? Because last week was week 4. So by the end of week 5. And then you'll find the next few weeks, there are more and more of those desk lectures. I've got quite a package of them. And I'd be interested to know, some students love them. Some of you find it better to just keep going with the class recordings. It's just completely up to what works for you. But on the whole, I found most of the OUA students prefer the desk lectures. So
yeah, it can be hard to hear the questions on the tape. That's the problem.
Yeah, I think I've got a bit slack at repeating questions. So that's a good reminder for me. Sorry about that. I am looking at you, by the way. I've just realised I'm not standing right in front of the camera. So just realised I'm looking like a politician off into the corner, but that's actually where you are. So you're down in the corner.
Sorry.
where did I start with that? I was starting to talk a bit more about consideration. So past consideration is one that we find some people find a bit worrying. Partly it's the language. So the technical term is past consideration, but past consideration is not good consideration. So basically, if you think about what I was just talking about, the idea is that the price of the promise needs to relate to the bargain that's made. So if you did something in the past, you can't use that thing you did in the past as consideration for something in the future. So that doesn't mean you can't prepay for something. So if I go into my local cafe and I hand over $50 and we agree that they'll just have a $50 credit, and every time I order a coffee until that's, I've got 10 coffees or 11 coffees or something, they'll hand them over. That's fine. I make that agreement then. But if I just go in and I buy a coffee and I give them $50 and say, keep the change, if I go in next time and say, oh, but I prepaid for that coffee, that's past consideration. They didn't necessarily agree. Now they might. It's nothing to stop you from agreeing. It's just not necessarily a legally enforceable contract because it's past consideration. The other one that tends to throw people a little bit, and it's, I think, as much as anything, because the whole rationale for having consideration is to have a reason to have an agreement be binding and be enforceable at law, is this idea that consideration needs to be legally sufficient, but it doesn't need to be adequate. So by that, I mean that it's not for the courts to work out whether you did a good deal or not. It is for the courts to work out whether you had a deal and whether there was an exchange of promises. So, and I think Justice Kirby's decision in Woolworths is a significant part of the reading for consideration, and I would suggest that you have a good look at that. Because I think that really helps you understand consideration as an overview. You're still muted, Susan.
Sorry, I just forget. I don't want to cough in the microphone. That's all.
Are you feeling better?
A little bit. I took 2 weeks off work, which is a shock. Yeah,
that's a long time. But yeah.
Yeah.
Still, given your job, I'm glad that you weren't coughing all over patients. That does make sense.
No, it was the temperature and the feeling unwell. No, just I was wondering about the Woolen Mills case, where I think if I recollect your lecture correctly, you talked about how the purchase of the wool wasn't contingent upon the promise of the rebate from the government. Now, is that the 50 plus 1% sort of rule, where it has to be more likely than not that was the case?
No, I don't think it's really that so much as, I mean, a lot of people have a lot of problems with Woolen Mills, and in the end, I've recommended more than once that people go back and read the whole of the decision, not just the extracts that are in the case book, because I think when it just if it starts to stress you, that decision, I think it makes better sense when you read the whole thing. But there are a number of things that are going on at play there. So, and we look at Woolen Mills in a number of different contexts as well. So we've already looked at it in the context of whether it was an offer, whether the policy and the rebate scheme was an offer capable of acceptance. It's complicated by the fact that it's a government department as well. And so one of the issues, which is sort of touches on contract law but is really a constitutional law issue, is whether or not the party who is purportedly making a promise has a capacity to make that promise. So when we're talking about humans, and we talk about capacity in a later topic, essentially sober adults of right mind have capacity to make promises. Companies have the capacity to make a promise, and and have that promise enforced against them, and they have also the capacity to sue in their own name. But they do those things through actors, through agents, usually directors, sometimes management, sometimes just people who they've appointed for that purpose. But government departments is an added complexity there. But when we look at woolen mills in the context of consideration, you'll see that this bargain requirement comes out. And the idea, so the Latin is quid pro quo, that the promise that is made needs to be in response to the promise that is received. And you might remember when I put up a kind of definition of what an offer was on the slide packs in the second week, I think. I've taken what I think is quite a good definition from, in fact, the American Contract Code, which it's wordy and sort of old-fashioned language, but I think it gets to the nub of it when it says that an offer is something that contains all of the, my words, DNA of the deal, so that it is presented in such a way that when the offeree understands that assenting to the offer will create an enforceable obligation on both of them. And so because of the nature of the woolen mills and the rebate, woolen mills is buying wool. That was what they did. They were always buying wool. They weren't buying wool from the government, but they had done some budgeting on the basis that they were going to get this rebate, which in fact they did get, and then they had to repay some of it, and then they brought an action. They might have been better off holding on to it. So they've then brought an action to say, but we had a contract where you offered to pay us this money if we did this. And so on the consideration point, the court said, well, you weren't buying the wool to get the rebate. You were buying the wool to process it. You bought Australian wool because, you know, in part you knew you could get this rebate and you budgeted that way, but there wasn't a quid pro quo. Whether it's a fair decision or not, but that's ultimately how the court found it. So it pushes out this idea that we need to have the bargain requirement. So another good example of that is Crown and Clark. So that's the case with the gentleman who was assisting the police with their inquiries, and it was made clear to him that he would get a lighter sentence if he were to provide some assistance in a different matter. Subsequently, he found out that there was a reward, and he claimed the reward. And he said, well, that's a contract. It was a unilateral contract. All he had to do was do the thing, and the contract was created. But the court found his lack of awareness of the promise meant that there wasn't that bargain arrangement. But again, I see that equally with woolen mills as a political decision as well. But I can be a bit cynical about these things.
And I was also wondering about conditional, when the condition of the product changes, this is to do with the banana.
I need to tell you a story about the banana, but go on.
So the thing is, the banana's edible, and so it gets eaten. So the condition of the product changes. But let's say, it was a pack of crisps or chips or whatever, you still can the barcode gives a certain value that you can offer, which would be unchanged by the fact that you've eaten it or not. But the problem is the weight of the banana will differ.
Well, but I think there are two different questions there. One is, because there's always this idea of, there's an invitation to treat in a supermarket.
Yeah.
And the conditions of entry into a supermarket, I mean, it's private property at the end of the day. But there is this idea that you can go in and you can grab stuff, and then you can make an offer to buy it at some point. I think there is an implied term that you don't go around eating our stuff while you're there. But, that is another issue. There could be a criminal issue here as well. the next set of issues are, well, if you're at that point, you're committing to buy, if you're actually going to consume the food in the supermarket, then there's a separate problem. Well, how do we work out what that costs?
Yeah.
And the thing is, there might be some sort of negotiation in relation to that.
Mm-hmm.
So you might need to have a look at the peel and go and get a similar sized banana and go and weigh it.
I was thinking you could make a bargain at the checkout and say this is.
Yeah, well, but the thing is, I mean, at the end of the day, the problem is when you've eaten the food, you've got the offer to buy, but there is no choice but to accept, really, is there? So, you know, I think at the end of the day, it's probably more a criminal law issue, the eating of the banana. Why I find this absolutely hilarious is this conversation. So when I first started at law school, you know, like 1984, and I, you know, because I was one of the really cool kids, of course, the first time I ever went out with a group of people from uni, they were from the debating club. And I ended up being driven home by this girl who I didn't know very well, and she was 4 or 5 years older than me. And she was, still is actually, a very large woman. And my mother came home and started to tell this long story. You can't imagine that I come from a family of long storytellers, about how she'd been in the supermarket and a very large man, and she kept going on and on and on about how big this guy was, had put his groceries through, and then said at the end he'd eaten a banana. And so they went through all this fussing around to get this banana. And I'm just sitting there completely humiliated that my mother's telling this really embarrassing story and going on and on about the weight of this person, where this quite large woman has driven me home. Anyway, that large woman and I have been very close friends ever since. My daughter now shares her name. Like, it was just, you know, whenever I think about people eating bananas in supermarkets, that's why I think of it.
So the principle I'm wondering to get at is, if the product condition is different than what is advertised in the offer, does that change the offer?
But if it's different because an offeree has changed it.
Yeah.
So I think it does. Well, you might, maybe there's a way of looking at it where it's, you know, the signs that say you break it, you buy it.
Yeah.
You eat it, you buy it, whatever the equivalent is. So it's an invitation to treat, but there is an offer, which is a unilateral offer. If the condition is broken, then you're effectively accepting by walking into the store that if you change the condition of the goods, that it's broken. I mean, the reality is it doesn't fit neatly into contract law.
No.
But at the end of the day, I think most people would think, well, and it's small beer, clearly, but that going into somebody's shop and eating their food, unless you are prepared to pay the list price for that food, that's stealing. And it's not technically it doesn't technically sit within the contract regime, but it's also not the sort of thing that you would be suing over anyway.
But what about if it was advertised as a certain type of product, but in fact you realised it wasn't that type of product when you purchased it? Is that change of condition?
Could be, if the conditions. It could be, depending on what the facts are. In those circumstances, you might also look at, these days, the Australian consumer law. So if the Australian consumer law applied, which it would to bananas in a supermarket, it might not to wholesale bananas. And for what it's worth, it may not apply to jousting sticks that are bought through eBay or Gumtree or whatever it is. So, you know, you need to make a call on that just in case you're kind of, you know, going down in a particular direction.
Yes.
But there are a range of implied terms, and they're terms that are implied by statute, which form part of any contract with a consumer, which include that goods need to be of a merchantable quality, that they need to match the description on the box. They need to be suitable for the purpose that was known to the person who's selling them that they were going to be used for, and those kind of things. So a breach of, or a change in the condition, or a failure to meet the condition might be a breach of a statutory warranty or guarantee, depending on what the source is.
But we're
Good
not.
questions. You kind of, you know, 6 weeks ahead of where we need to be, Susan. But I think you're thinking about it the right way. It's just sometimes our examples can be too small.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the devil's in the detail then.
Mm. Sorry, guys.
They're smiling. They look like they want to go and eat bananas now.
No, I'm smiling because I have a friend who works at Choice, and I literally had this conversation with her about 3 hours ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we look at implied terms towards the end, and then you will do. Actually, you don't have to do it anymore. Competition and consumer law is no longer a core subject, so it's an elective. But it is. I must admit, I find the competition side of it more interesting than the consumer law side. But it's a good elective, and it's about. I would say it's probably 80% competition law and 20% consumer law, and we kind of expand from where we're on now. But yeah, if you're interested in this kind of thing, that would be an elective to think about a little later on.
Cool.
All right, anything more, or will we finish up? Bryony, you look like you have a question.
I was just thinking. No, it's gone.
Well, you know where to find me, right? So I'm not sure about you guys. I actually have to make a diary note to go in and look at those discussions to see if there've been questions have been raised there. And then I'm making sure that the OUA and the face-to-face ones match. So if questions are raised on one, I copy them over to the other. And if people ask me questions by email, I kind of desensitize them a bit and put them up that way. So it's worth looking there. But don't be shy about just sending me an email if you've got a question, or getting on the phone, and yeah, we'll just move it forward.
Thank you. There was another question, not related to contract, but I saw something about the law ball in September.
Oh yeah, you should come to the law ball if you're based in Melbourne. I'm going.
I'm actually interstate, but I do have friends in Melbourne, so I'm like, oh, I wonder if I can tee it up.
Well, if you can, you should get you need to work it out pretty quickly. But if you can, I think it's a great way to meet a few people, and I think last year was the first year last year was the first time they did it, and it was a remarkable success. And it was quite fun. So, yeah. And I always think, well, 80% more, 90% of my interaction with RMIT is students, not with the staff. Mm-hmm. So I'd rather go to a student event than a staff one. So that's what I'm doing. You're in Melbourne, Sue. Are you coming?
Yeah, I know I'm on call, so I'm not sure.
Shame. Shame. What about you, David? Are you in Melbourne?
I'm in Sydney, but I might have to come to Melbourne for work at some point in the next month or so. So at the very least, I think I'll try and come along to a lecture.
That'd be lovely.
Yeah.
You'd be very, very welcome.
David, I'm a fellow Sydney person too.
Oh, good.
Yeah, well, you need to find your people, especially when you have group work things in OUA. But it's really good to, find a way to catch up and steal a banana from a supermarket and talk about
it. Or not.
Or not. No, I'm only teasing. I just realised that'll be on the recording unless I'm very judicious with my editing. Something like that. Anyway, I can smell the dinner that I cooked in the other room and I'm hungry. So I'm going to, unless you've got more questions, I'm going to love and leave you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy dinner. Thank you so much.
Bye.